Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in the global cycle when the world shifts quietly long before the majority notices anything. Right now, we are standing at the front edge of one of those shifts. If you own gold or silver, this is not just another market update. This is a warning about a structural change forming beneath the surface of the economy. You can sense when the world is moving toward a point it can't step back from. It doesn't happen suddenly. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until the underlying structure becomes too strained to continue in the same direction. That's where we are right now, on the brink of a monetary transition that has been decades in the making. And like every major shift in the past, it isn't driven by one event or one country, but by the cumulative pressure of debt cycles, geopolitical conflict, and declining trust in the systems that once held everything together. The foundation of the global economy is built on confidence. Confidence that governments can manage their debts, that currencies will hold their value, and that institutions will operate in ways that keep things stable. When that confidence weakens, everything built on top of it becomes fragile. Today, confidence isn't collapsing, but it is eroding, and erosion is often more dangerous because people don't notice it until the structure begins to give way. Debt levels are reaching points that historically lead to adjustments, not because anyone wants them, but because the math stops working. When obligations exceed the capacity to service them through productivity, nations inevitably turn to monetary solutions. Printing more, restructuring, or devaluing. Each of those outcomes leads to some form of transition. What makes this moment especially significant is that many major economies are reaching this stage simultaneously. It's not one country dealing with imbalances, it's a global system confronting the limits of a long-term debt cycle. The last time this happened on a comparable scale was in the mid-20th century when high debt, war, and social divisions forced a complete redesign of monetary arrangements. Today, the dynamics are different, but the drivers are remarkably familiar. Rising political polarization, widening wealth gaps, and increasing geopolitical rivalry are symptoms of deeper financial pressures that have been building beneath the surface. In this kind of environment, policymakers tend to face choices that aren't ideal. When debt becomes too large to repay conventionally, history shows they rely on financial repression, inflation, and controlled devaluations to ease the burden. These tools don't solve the underlying problem. They redistribute it. They shift the pain from governments to savers, from creditors to consumers, and from national balance sheets to household budgets. That shift is subtle at first, but over time it forces individuals, institutions, and nations to rethink where they store their wealth and how they protect purchasing power. That's why real assets begin to play a larger role during transitions. It's not because they suddenly become more valuable. It's because paper claims become less reliable. When currencies lose purchasing power, when bonds no longer compensate for risk, and when financial markets become distorted by intervention, people naturally turn to things that can't be printed or manipulated as easily. Gold, silver, commodities, and productive assets have historically served as hedges against these periods, not as speculative opportunities, but as anchors in a shifting environment. We're also entering a phase where the global balance of power is changing. Rising economies are seeking more influence. Established ones are protecting their positions, and the monetary system, built around a single dominant currency, is facing pressures from all sides. This doesn't imply a sudden collapse or replacement, but transitions are rarely abrupt. They happen through gradual adjustments, countries reducing reliance on a single reserve currency, forming new trade blocs, accumulating alternate reserves, or settling transactions in diversified forms. Each small step pushes the system toward a new equilibrium. Challenge for most people is that transitions feel confusing while they're happening. The signals are mixed, the narratives conflict, and the changes unfold slowly until a tipping point is reached. But the underlying forces follow patterns that have repeated throughout history. Excessive debt leads to monetary expansion. Monetary expansion leads to inflationary pressures. Inflation leads to loss of trust. Loss of trust leads to movement into real assets. And eventually, the system restructures itself into a new form, one that resets the cycle. Right now, we're in the stage where awareness is growing, but action is still limited. The majority hasn't adjusted yet because the effects haven't hit them directly. But the world is already behaving differently. Central banks are preparing for outcomes the public hasn't fully recognized. Nations are insulating themselves. Investors who understand long-term cycles are positioning quietly. A monetary transition isn't something to fear. It's something to understand because those who see it early aren't caught off guard. They're prepared for the world that emerges on the other side. Gold and silver are no longer behaving like traditional assets. They're becoming strategic necessities. Throughout history, whenever economies reached the later stages of long-term debt cycles, when the value of money became uncertain and institutions struggled to maintain stability, societies instinctively shifted toward what held value across time, conflict, and systemic change. We're seeing that shift again, not just among investors, but among nations, corporations, and financial systems that are quietly repositioning themselves for an environment where paper wealth becomes more fragile and tangible value becomes essential. For decades, gold and silver were treated as alternative assets, useful but not central. That perception is quickly fading. The actions of central banks around the world tell a different story. They are buying gold at the fastest pace in modern records, signaling that the motivations are no longer about diversification but protection. These institutions understand something that the average investor hasn't fully internalized yet. When the global monetary landscape becomes unstable, the assets that survive are the ones that don't depend on political promises or central bank policy. Gold plays a role that no currency can replicate. It has no counterparty risk, no liability attached to it, and no government can create more of it to solve short-term problems. When trust declines, gold becomes the benchmark against which everything else is measured. Silver, often overlooked, entering a similar phase, but with an added dimension. Its industrial importance is becoming critical, especially as the global economy shifts toward electrification, renewable energy, and high-tech manufacturing. Silver is not only a monetary hedge, it's becoming a resource that modern systems can't function without. Dual nature, monetary and industrial, puts silver in a position where supply pressures and monetary pressures can converge. The world is moving toward an environment where resilience matters more than optimism. In such moments, financial systems lean on assets that provide insurance against the unknown. Gold and silver have provided that insurance for thousands of years. They've outlasted currency regimes, government collapses, wars, and economic resets. And every time societies moved through turbulent transitions, These metals played the role of stabilizers, absorbing uncertainty that financial instruments couldn't handle. The shift happening now is structural, not cyclical. For a long time, financial markets were shaped by low interest rates, abundant liquidity, and expanding credit. Conditions made leverage easy and made traditional assets, stocks, bonds, real estate appear stable. But that environment is changing. High debt levels restrict growth, inflation erodes purchasing power, and geopolitical fragmentation introduces risks that markets aren't designed to price efficiently. In an environment like this, assets that stand outside the financial system become central to long-term planning. Nations understand this better than individuals. Nations operate on longer timelines. When a country increases its gold reserves, it's not trying to profit from price fluctuations. It's securing strategic leverage. It gives them independence from foreign currencies, protection against devaluation, and a form of collateral that remains valuable no matter how the international system evolves. When many countries accumulate gold simultaneously, it signals that the global architecture of money is shifting. Silver is entering this equation through necessity. As the world electrifies, silver is irreplaceable. Its supply, however, constrained by declining ore grades, underinvestment in mining, and rising industrial consumption. When an asset becomes economically essential and simultaneously serves as a scarcity-based store of value, it moves from being a commodity to a strategic lifeline. The same institutions that once ignored silver are now quietly studying its supply dynamics because they understand that future shortages aren't just possible. They're increasingly likely. For individuals, the implications are significant. Holding gold and silver is no longer about chasing returns. It's about understanding the vulnerabilities of the global system. When the value of money becomes unstable, the assets that preserve purchasing power become a form of self-reliance. They provide the freedom to navigate transitions without being dependent on institutions that may struggle to manage the consequences of decades of accumulated imbalances. We're entering a phase where gold and silver will not merely be part of a portfolio, they will be foundational to long-term stability. They are shifting from optional investments to critical hedges against a world where financial systems are being forced to evolve. Recognizing this shift early isn't about predicting a crisis. It's about understanding how transitions unfold and positioning yourself on the side of resilience rather than